Well, hello and welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. We are so glad that you have joined us today. And I am super excited about my next guest, my first ever Aussie guest on the show. Pastor Ali Cawthorn, or Dr. Ali Cawthorn, received her doctorate from Fuller Theological Seminary. She is a pastor with her husband and her kids at Urban Church in Perth, Western Australia, has 3 beautiful children and is just an absolute genius. She's also on the national executive for the Australian Christian churches, so a wonderful Pentecostal as well, which I love. But part of her doctorate was looking at St. Ignatius of Loyola. So very excited today to be talking with her about St. Ignatius of Loyola. So thank you, Pastor Ali, for joining us. It's so good to have you with us.
It is my pleasure. I can't quite believe that I'm doing this, but I am excited because I've heard some of the other podcasts you've done, and I'm like, wow, these people are incredible. So hopefully I can do Ignatius justice.
You are incredible. I don't know how we conned you into doing it, but thank you so much for coming on. And super excited. I've been able to hear a little bit about your research and your thesis that you produced, and it just sounds absolutely brilliant, even for our own spiritual formation and how that can help us today. So super excited to be looking into that. And I love your bookshelf there as well, Pastor Ali. Is that your home office?
It is my home office.
Amazing.
I have an addiction to books. It's kind of like, it's
I love
not
it.
Good
It's an obsession, but it's a welcomed obsession. I love it.
Yeah.
So awesome. Well, let's dive into St. Ignatius of Loyola. So Pastor Ali, could you give us his background, his spiritual formation, and a bit of his journey, how he came to be one of the voices that we know in Christianity today?
Absolutely. He has quite an incredible life. And I thought we'd just sort of go on the journey that he went on in his own formation, which is primarily in Spain. And then he spends a bit of time in Paris and Jerusalem and then ends in Rome. So we'll kind of go on that. I know, we'll go on that journey with him. Yeah. So he was born in 1491 in Spain, in a town this is a thing about kind of the Spanish mystics. They all have these weird kind of town name. I'm not going to try and speak Spanish. So anyway, he was born in 1491, and he was born into nobility, into a wealthy family, and he grew up in his ancestral castle in Loyola, which is where we get that name. And he went by his kind of birth name, which was Inigo, until 1535, when he changed his name into the Latin version of that, which is obviously Ignatius. Wow. But he was the youngest of 13 children.
Whoa.
And I know, and one of 7 boys within that family. His mum actually died when he was 7 years old, which was pretty sad. But he obviously grew up in a time of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. He was a contemporary of Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. I mean, you kind of got to wonder what was in the water in Spain at that time, right? Like, it was
definitely
amazing people. But he was quite a character. So he was very interested in fame and fortune, and kind of being a soldier and doing these great exploits, and very interested in gambling and womanizing. And he was a real kind of ladies' man.
Wow.
Very much about his appearance. You know, his ego led his life in a very real way. He was really determined, and he loved to take risks. But in 1521, when he was about 30, that all changed, because God sort of entered his life actually through a time of suffering, and through a time of recovering from an injury that he sustained while he was in battle with the French. So he was a soldier, and he obviously went into active service. And when he was in a town called Pamplona, the French fired their cannonballs into where he went. Yes. And one of them hit his legs. And so he obviously could no longer fight, because his leg, one leg in particular, was really injured, and he went into a long period of recovering from that. And so to do that, he went back to his family castle in Loyola, and that actually began his conversion. So he was not converted through hearing the gospel or anything like that. He hadn't received any training at that point, but God just started to show up. It's actually quite an extraordinary story, and his period of recovery took way longer than it actually should, because what happened was his leg, it healed, but there was this bone that protruded out of his leg just below his knee, and it didn't look very nice. And so he was really obviously concerned with how he looked. Was he going to be able to get the women after this?
I like that that's his main concern.
Absolutely. Like, it was all about these, this fame and fortune and, getting the ladies. So he actually had his leg rebroken and reset, and went through this series of, I don't know what you'd call it, like, not practices, hell, basically, where he would have his leg stretched and lengthened. Yeah. So these instruments that would lengthen and stretch his legs, because he just wanted to look good, right?
Good.
So
for the fashion.
That's how important it was to him. So while he was spending time getting over this, he was obviously a bit bored, and he asked for some books, and he really wanted books on chivalry and being a soldier and all of that. But the only books that were available were The Life of Christ by Ludolf and the Book of the Lives of the Saints. And so he spent time, he thought, well, may as well read them. Like, I'm so bored, I'm going to read these books. But something really quite extraordinary started to happen. So he found that as he read them, he was really drawn to the life of the saints. And initially it became this kind of competition, in that he thought, I reckon I could live a better life. I could be a better saint than them. Like, they were that good, but I could be even better. Like, that's the kind of guy that he was.
I like this guy. He's a go-getter.
Yeah. He was out there. But he would spend hours then starting to imagine what it would have been like to be with Jesus and to be one of his disciples. And then he'd spend some time thinking about his old life and, what it was like to go to battle and, the gambling and the women. And so he would alternate between these two kind of, I guess, daydreams, imaginations. But he found that even though when he thought about his old life and the exploits and the fame and fortune that he would do gave him kind of initial good feeling, afterwards he would just be left feeling really dry and empty. It was like, wow, that just didn't sustain me. But when he was thinking about religious life, the life of the saints, he actually started to feel really satisfied. Like, it touched something within him that just left this lingering feeling of joy. And so he started to realize that there was different spirits at play here. And he would call them like the good spirit and the evil spirit, and to become very aware of how they were present to him as he thought about these different kinds of life. And eventually he started to move away from thinking about, this life of worldly fame and being a soldier and all of this, and was just drawn more and more to the life of Jesus. And in that time, so many seeds of what would be some of his most incredible work were being planted. Things like discernment of spirits, how to discern how God is leading, which then became this whole way of making decisions, godly decisions, and forms the foundation for his exercises, and this emphasis on meditation and using his imagination and being focused on Jesus and the importance of journaling and all of that. So all of that started to take root right back then. And his love for these books his love for these books just grew, and he started to write down what he was learning from them. And by the time he left Loyola, he'd written about 300 pages of how, what he was learning through this and how this spirit was moving within him. He has this vision then of Jesus while he's at at Loyola. And it kind of leads to these two things. First of all, this great feeling of consolation, but then this, what he would call this internal purging. He just wanted to get out of him everything that stood in the way of having this life dedicated to Jesus. And actually that kind of purging comes to a bit of a peak when he gets to Manresa, because he decides that he's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to go where Jesus walked, maybe even die for his faith. And so he leaves Loyola and sort of heads towards Jerusalem. But before he does, he has this other kind of incredible moment where he's standing up under the night sky and he feels this kind of explosion within him where he just wants to serve Christ. He just has this long to serve him, and which is amazing when you look at Psalm 19 talks about how the story of God is written in the sky and the stars, and I love that sort of thing. So
sounds like a very Pentecostal experience to me.
Yes, it does. It does. So, and that's why I think Ignatius translates so well into our context, because it's so experiential and it's so Christ focused, and eventually becomes so scripturally based. Anyway, so he's like, yes, I want to follow Jesus, and he just pores over these texts because he didn't have any Bible to read.
Wow.
So he didn't know how to speak Latin. There were no Spanish Bibles available. So his exposure to Jesus was through this book, The Life of Christ. And so much of what he even learned through that book, we see written through the exercises that he writes. It's extraordinary, though, that the encounters that he has and these kind of revelations that he has right up until he eventually does have theological training are so theologically sound. Like it's truly an encounter with the Spirit of God.
I love that. And I love that point you just highlighted as well, that we can come to theological truth through the teaching of the Holy Spirit, who leads and guides us into all truth. We don't necessarily have to be the most intellectual theologian or scholar or anything like that. The Holy Spirit is still actually leading and guiding us into truth.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Ignatius just becomes so aware of this. It's almost like he enters into this school with the Spirit of God, and he obviously has these other texts which are beautiful as well, but it's amazing. It's amazing how it all kind of pans out. But actually the Life of Christ also recommends meditating on the gospel narratives as well. So Ignatius has this real hunger to do that, and it's that form of meditation that ends up forming the basis of his exercises. So he leaves Loyola on the way to Jerusalem, and in about 1522 he heads off there with this kind of passion to serve Jesus, and he goes to Montserrat first, which is on the way to Manresa. And it's a really funny story actually. On the way, he comes across this Moor, which was a Muslim from the area, and they have this really heated discussion. They have a fight, and Ignatius is so enraged because he's a very emotive guy, right? And he feels like this guy has dishonored Mary in particular, and challenged the virgin birth. And so Ignatius is like, I am going to maintain her honor, and I'm going to search him out. So he leaves. He goes in the opposite direction to where Ignatius is going. And he thinks, I'm going to find him and I'm going to stab him with my dagger. So
no.
Yeah,
I'm going to stab him.
So I'm going to stab him. So the soldier is still there, right? The soldier is still kind of being transformed. So what he thinks, what should I do? So he's riding a mule on the way, and he goes, you know what? I'm going to get back on my mule, And if the mule heads in the direction of this guy, then that's a sign that I'm supposed to go and stab him. But if the mule heads this way, then I'll just let him go.
That's
and
hilarious.
So luckily for us, the mule heads the other way and saves this other guy's life.
Oh, that is amazing. And it's sort of like telling of that time as well, like just leading into the Reformation, how people would just like, they'd defend their ideas with blood, you know?
Yeah.
With the sword.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, but even then, even as he's making that decision, which is the God honoring way, what's the will of God? Like, even there, we see the seeds of what he eventually develops into his discernment process. So, which is quite incredible. So he arrives at Montserrat. He goes into a Benedictine monastery, and he finds a confessor, and he spends 3 days writing out his confession. He gives his confession, and then he slips away for what he calls a vigil of alms, which is what you would do if you were going to be like an earthly knight, but he does it in service of Christ. So he's now a knight for Christ.
Oh, and actually how cool is that?
I know that kind of soldier war, serving a king kind of imagery stays with him. It even comes through in his exercises as well. But in March of 1522, he takes off his kind of nice clothes, gives them to a beggar, puts on a pilgrim's tunic, and just spends hours in prayer. He leaves his dagger at the altar, and he's now just serving Christ. He then heads to Manresa, and it's here where his formation really kind of heats up, I guess you could say. And so he thinks, I'm just going to stay here for a few days. I'm just going to take some notes about what happened at Montserrat. But he ends up being there for about 11 months, so nearly a year he spends there. And it's really there where God starts really molding him. And he embraces like the ascetic life. He decides that he's going to eat no meat, drink no wine, but he also didn't comb or cut his hair or his fingernails or toenails.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no, no. That's terrible.
I know. You can imagine.
Especially what from a guy who broke his leg like 6 times or whatever to impress the ladies for fashion. If he's like now growing his hair and his fingernails and toenails. Yeah. It's a very big difference. Well, somewhere in between might be good.
Well, exactly. But this is why he does it, because he's like, I'm gonna go against kind of this vainness that has gripped me my whole life. So he swings the pendulum to the other. I mean, we never swing pendulums, right? It's not like we go from that to that.
Not at
all. Never seen that in church since. But anyway, so he does that, and he actually starts to then also read The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And
awesome.
He said like that could accompany his exercises, loves this book. Beautiful. But the other thing that happens here is he really starts to struggle with this exaggerated sense of self-condemnation. He becomes like so aware of his sinfulness, and he feels really guilty for the life that he's led and really worthless. And he heads into a time of actual really deep despair. He just goes to confession several times a day, and his confessor actually starts to feel worried for him and says, you need to stop. Don't come to confession anymore. This is not doing you any good. And he just couldn't overcome it. And he gets to the point where he nearly thinks, I'm going to end it. I can't, I'm so aware of how sinful I am. And some of what he suffers was due to his own extreme asceticism. So the fasting and some of the ways that he would kind of punish himself. But he has, again, this kind of series of mystical experiences with the Lord, encounters, let's call them encounters, with the Lord. And he realizes, actually, I'm not going to be able to help anybody like this, because one of the kind of themes of his life is he just wants to help souls. He wants to help people deepen their relationship with God. And he becomes so acutely aware of how actually mercifully loved he is, even though he is this sinner, the love of Jesus. And one of the exercises that you do if you go through them is, you recount the ways that what he ends up describing sin as the ways that we turn away from the love of God, which I love that. That's just,
I love that too.
Feels like beautiful. An invitation. I know. So you do that and you come with all this awareness of the way that you turn and place it at the cross of Jesus and have this conversation with him. Like it's, that act of that cruciform love that just, there's nowhere to hide. And still Jesus looks at you and says, still I will do it, even with all of these things that you're bringing to me. Like it's stunning. It's so beautiful. So he sits by this river and he has this revelation about the Trinity. And remember, still hasn't had any formal theological kind of education. And he has this depths of understanding about the Trinity. And he even says later in life, he looks back on that period as, the time when God was just teaching him so much. It formed so much of who he was. Up and down time in Manresa, very transformative. And so he leaves there and he goes through Barcelona on the way to Jerusalem. And he's like, I'm in Jerusalem. I just want to help souls. But eventually he's actually ordered to leave Jerusalem by the Franciscans, who were saying, your life is in danger here. You need to leave. And it was this really interesting time because he thought, hang on, I thought I was, called to go to Jerusalem. But actually, again, this factors into his work on discernment, because he realizes, well, did I actually ask the Lord if I should go to Jerusalem, or was that just what you did at the time? Like, was that just another adventure, another feat that I wanted to accomplish? So I love how reflective Ignatius is. He's always like ensuring every experience is feeding into his spiritual formation. So, which is probably, why I love him. I'm so drawn to him. So he realizes that he needs to actually speak Latin. And so he goes back to learn Latin alongside primary school children at 33. So he's trying to learn this language so that he can, so he can engage with the language. And he then heads off to Paris, and he decides, I'm going to receive a formal theological education. He goes to the University of Paris and spends some time studying there. And it's while he's there that he starts to gather other like-minded friends around him. He starts to offer them the exercises and have what he calls spiritual conversations, which also begin to form one another in community, which is another big theme of Ignatian spirituality. And so in 1534, Ignatius and 6 of his friends take a vow of poverty and chastity, and they're like, we're going to go again to missionary work and be missionaries in Jerusalem. But if we don't get there, we're going to go to Rome and just offer ourselves to the Pope. Just, how can we be of service? So in 1537, they're in Venice, and they're just giving people the spiritual exercises, just taking people through them. They are, serving in hospitals, and actually Ignatius spent quite a bit of time serving the dying in hospices, and just, beautiful work. And then they realize we actually can't secure a passage to Jerusalem, so let's go to Rome. So they head to Rome and they offer themselves in service to the Pope. But on the way, Ignatius has another encounter actually at a church, again with has this vision of Jesus, and he realizes, actually, I think the Lord is asking me to start my own order that is totally focused on Jesus. So he has a very Trinitarian theology, but an absolute focus on Jesus, which is why his order is called the Society of Jesus.
I love that.
All about Jesus. So in 39, he presents it all to the Pope in Rome, and in 1540, it is the Pope says, yes, you can have this Society of Jesus. Ignatius initially wanted it to be called the Company of Jesus because that was a military term. So there's still this kind of old flavor.
The Army of the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and that's pretty much where he stays for the rest of his life. He basically administers the Society of Jesus from Rome. He writes the constitutions there, which instructs how Jesuits should be formed in their formation for the priesthood. But he was very much about being contemplatives in the world. So he would say to, the other Jesuits, the world is your monastery. So go and change the world for Jesus. They sent missionaries to India and Japan and the Congo and Brazil, and set up several educational colleges throughout Europe. Ignatius, while he was still alive, he oversaw the birth of 37 educational colleges throughout Italy and Spain alone. That eventually then went into Germany. And then they did start to have a primary focus on actively opposing the Protestant Reformation.
Yes.
And
I think that's a good thing to bring out, because I think often as people who are sort of Protestant offshoots, like Pentecostals and that sort of thing, sometimes we can look back on the Reformation as like the bad Catholics and the good Protestants. But you see, like, especially with Ignatius and his guys, there are people who were genuine in their spiritual formation and their pursuit of God and their pursuit of spirituality and Christianity within the Catholic Church at that time, and fighting for the continual unification of the church, not this split at the time. So
absolutely. And the Jesuits were really instrumental in that kind of counter-reformation of the Catholic churches as well. So he actually died fairly young. He died at 64 from malaria that was endemic at the time. But at the time of his death, it was saying that he had written over 6,000 letters to Jesuits, the most ever of anybody at the time. So yeah, he was a really prolific writer and amazing life. So
Pastor Ali, that's incredible. I feel like I've learned so much even in just that first spiritual formation question. Are you able to I know you've already mentioned some of the spiritual disciplines and the different things that he's written. Can you tell us a bit about those big works that he's contributed to, or the spiritual disciplines and different things that he's known to have contributed to Christianity?
Absolutely. I mean, so obviously there's the establishment of the Jesuits, which is one of the largest Roman Catholic orders today. There's about 17,000 Jesuit priests across the world. And actually the current Pope is a Jesuit. He's the first Jesuit Pope. So there's that. But in terms of his writings, definitely the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are by far his most well-known work. It's still used today, and it's really enjoying I guess I wouldn't call it a revival. I'm not sure it's happened before, but interest in Protestant kind of arenas as well, which Ignatius would have been more than happy with, because his heart was to make them as adaptable as possible so that people could have access to them. So them, and then obviously his work with discernment, discernment of spirits, and then discernment for decision making. A lot of what he kind of maps out when it comes to discernment and making decisions is still, so Ruth Haley Barton actually wrote a book about discerning in groups and how to do that. They are all Ignatian principles, so people still write about that. The prayer called the Examen, so he didn't necessarily write that, but he definitely brought it into prominence. So that is a kind of a prayer that you would pray and in the morning and in the evening for his Jesuits. And he was actually saying, even if you do no other prayer during the day, make sure that you pray the examen morning and night. And the examen it has 5 steps. You sort of start with gratitude. You look back over your day and you start to ask the Lord, okay, where were you? Where did I feel you? Where did I turn away from you? What grace do I need tomorrow? And what he was doing with that, what that prayer does is start to train you in that awareness of what he calls consolation and desolation, which are movements of your spirit. So it's not necessarily about your emotions, even though emotions as well do play a part in your formation. Emotions are great messengers, terrible masters. So we're not led by our emotions, but we also can't ignore them because we are embodied beings, right? So how we feel, often is trying to tell us something, even if it is telling us, hey, you've got some fear here, or you don't have faith here. If we ignore that, we're missing an invitation just to deeper formation. So he is all about embracing that, but then trying to drop below it into, how is it leading me? Is it leading me towards the Lord, or is it leading me away from the Lord? So that's the consolation, desolation. Imaginative contemplation, Ignatius was, that placing yourself in the gospel stories, being very aware of, where you are, who you are, what are you hearing, what are you seeing? He uses that word contemplation in a potentially a different way to how other kind of mystical writers use it. We would probably consider that to be more of a discursive meditation, the way that he uses that word. And then the colloquy,
can you
which
explain
comes out
what that means, just for people who haven't sort of heard anything about contemplation and that sort of thing? What is it usually, and then what's the difference with Ignatius?
So most mystical writers, or Christian mystics, or spiritual formation writers, would use contemplation as a gift, actually, that is given to you by the Lord, where you kind of, how would I describe it? It's sort of like that moment where it's just you and the Lord, and generally it's kind of imageless, it's wordless. It's because God is beyond any of the kind of way that we would try to describe him. So it's that deep sense of union. It's that deep sense of communing with the Spirit of God, and you can, you can open yourself up to the transforming presence of Christ. We can engage in these spiritual practices, but ultimately that kind of experience of union is a gift that we're given by the Lord. And some writers would say you only ever kind of taste that this side of, the ultimate consummation of our relationship with God. But meditation, the discursive meditation, so going over it in your head, thinking about what is happening, having that conversation, what am I seeing? Oh, who's speaking to me? What am I saying back? That's kind of more the meditation that Ignatius uses in his exercises.
Wow.
Lectio Divina is a really good way as well of helping to kind of delineate those steps. So
cool. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So again,
we have a lot of like Pentecostal charismatics who probably haven't ever heard of these sorts of terms.
So Lectio means sacred reading, and it's a way of engaging with your Bible that you're not engaging with it to necessarily learn anything. It's not about memorizing the text. It's not a scholarly activity. It's a formational way of approaching the text. So you take a short passage, so you wouldn't not even a chapter, like a short passage, and then read it. That's the Lectio. That's the first step. And actually, I recommend, even in your own personal devotion, to actually read the Bible out loud, because there's something about hearing it. I find there's something about hearing the Bible read that engages a different sense. It engages a different part of us and brings it to life for me. Anyway, so you hear it, you might read it, a few times, and then you begin to become aware of what's standing out to you. Is there a word? Is there a phrase that's standing out to you? And so then you just stay with that and start to meditate on it. And, just in your mind, maybe say the phrase, say the word, what comes to you as you do that. Is there a feeling? Is there an image? What is arising for you? What is being evoked for you through this? And then you would offer back a prayer to the Lord. So you thank him for what it is he's showing you, or, even just having a conversation. It's like, wow. So it could be as simple as, I'm drawn to this word. I'm drawn to this phrase that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, God. But I'm having a lot of trouble really receiving that. And I feel like I can't fully. So why is this standing out to me? What are you inviting me into here, Lord? Can you show me? It just as simple as that, like a friendship with God.
Beautiful.
And then you kind of just sit in that space, and then it's contemplatio, which is that contemplative space where you're just sitting with what is. It's just you and the Lord, the Creator, his creation, enjoying one another, enjoying that kind of communing sense. So that's like a step process into a contemplative space. Whereas Ignatius, there's room for that as well in his exercises, but it's probably much more initially anyway, heady. It's like, okay, I'm thinking about this. Where am I? Which is probably why, to be honest, I was so attracted to Ignatius, because it is quite pragmatic. I mean, I love encounters. I'm Pentecostal. I love the Spirit of God, but my mind is so, like, I feel like I have a 12-lane freeway continually going in my mind. It's like, often somebody asks me a question, it's like, hang on a second, I've just got to let that car come off the freeway. That's what it feels like for me. So I guess to have these kind of pragmatic steps gives my mind somewhere to go, and then opens my spirit in a different way. So
beautiful. I love that. Sort of gives it direction to your sort of spiritual.
It does. It does. So just briefly, the exercises.
Yes, please.
So if any Jesuit actually completes what's called the full 30-day retreat. So they go into a retreat center for a month, don't speak to anybody other than a spiritual director, and they go through the exercises. But today you can do them in daily life, so it might take you about 9 months. Still go through them with a spiritual director. So they're in 4 what Ignatius calls weeks, but a week isn't necessarily 7 days. It's just a period of time. So you could think of it like 4 movements. I like to think of it as 4 movements.
Cool.
The first movement is all about what I was saying before, kind of that deepening revelation of the mercy of God. The fact that, you actually do, one of the meditations is you kind of imagine the Trinity looking over the world and at all of the people and, the things that are happening on the earth, and having this conversation, who will go, and it's, Jesus, I'll go. Anyway, it's amazing. You place yourself there. And then you realize, wow, this was for me. This was for me. Jesus died for me. It just brings it right back in. So it can be quite confrontational as well, because you're just being really aware of this is how I turn away from him. And the second week is by far the longest, and it's all about the life of Jesus. It's the gospel narratives and meditations. The third week, you spend the week with Jesus on his way to the cross. And, and really what it's asking you is how are you with suffering? How present can you be to suffering, your own and other people's and the world's? And then the fourth week is the resurrection. So you're with him in the joy of, obviously his resurrection. And then you end with the contemplation to attain divine love, it's called, where you just look at the world in a totally different way. So beautiful. It's transformational. Dallas Willard calls it a school of discipleship, one of the best training that you can receive. So
amazing. Oh, that's incredible. Just even hearing a brief overview of all of his work just makes me want to just dive into Ignatius's material and that sort of thing. So, Pastor Ali, are you able to just sort of tell us, I know we've already been able to apply all of this already, but can you sort of tell us how does Ignatius speak to us today in our Christian experience, in our Christian formation? How does his voice speak to us and guide us in our Christianity?
Yeah, well, I think that Christ-centered focus is always a great place to start. I love that Ignatius encourages that continual reflection, that continual self-awareness, God awareness. What is God doing? How am I moved by that? What are all of the ways that I turn away from him? The discernment stuff is so valuable. How am I making decisions? Like, am I actually holding this before the Lord, or and then am I led by my gut, my heart? What's going on there? And just his dedication, his devotion to Jesus. I mean, it's inspiring. And his commitment to push past those times when he realizes, there are things that push against our continual movement into our deeper formation and our relationship with God, and this is how you can respond to that. And to me, the way that it informs us really is in that formational space. It provides that path and that invitation to always just go deeper.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. Well, Pastor Ali, can you tell us any of maybe your favorite quotes from Ignatius, or just some famous quotes that he's well known for?
Yeah, so I love this one. It says, act as if everything depended on you, and trust as if everything depended on God.
Amazing. That's such a popular one today, isn't it? Like, I've heard that. I never knew it was attributed to him, but yeah, that's a very popular one.
And he also said, go forth and set the world on fire.
I love that
one.
Yeah.
And one more. The man who sets about making others better is wasting his time unless he begins with himself.
Yeah, so beautiful. Wow. Also, all very practical as well. Just an insight into him, as you've so brilliantly explained him. So do you have, we always like to do a bit of a look at some fun stories, fun facts. Yes. Do you have any fun facts or fun stories that you can share with us about St. Ignatius of Loyola?
Well, the funnest one, I think, was the donkey one, the mule one that I've already shared. I think that is hilarious. The fact that he had to have his leg re-broken so that he looked nice. Actually, someone was saying,
nice?
Well, yeah, I was reading somewhere in one of the millions of books that because they would wear those tights, how the men would wear those tights, and
very
so
attractive.
He wanted his legs to look nice in the tights. Reset. I think they're probably the two funnest things about him.
Yeah, his vanity and his donkey stabbing situation.
Yes,
that's awesome.
Funny.
Oh, Pastor Ali, this has been so educational, so wonderful. Thank you so much for everything you've shared. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience? Any encouragement that you can give them when looking at St. Ignatius of Loyola?
I think, if you ever have the opportunity to go through the exercises, to weigh that up. I mean, there is some imagery in there. There is some stuff that doesn't necessarily translate beautifully into our context, but what I do know is that Ignatius would have been fine with that. Like, you know, apply it as it fits. There are more and more kind of Protestants that are being trained in giving them. And you know what, I would also encourage people to consider going on a retreat regularly as part of their spiritual formation, to have space and time where it's just them and the Lord. And I find that is part of my rule of life and so important.
Beautiful.
So, yeah,
that's awesome. Thank you so much, Pastor Ellie. This has just been amazing. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm honestly, after this recording, I'm going to dive into some of St. Ignatius of Loyola's material, because I just think it's so, it sounds so incredible. So thank you so much for being with us today.
You're so welcome. It was fun.
Thank you. And to everyone who's been watching or listening, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Eagle and Child podcast. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Eagle and Child podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.